Hey, are you ready to grow your business? You have checked out the number one resource for business leaders, entrepreneurs, startup founders, and managers. And we're going to teach you how to grow and scale your business with real actionable steps. There's no fluff in this podcast. It's just good advice. Check out this episode. If you're a first-time listener, make sure you subscribe to the podcast. And if you enjoy this episode, leave us a 5-star review. Today's episode is with Paul Smith. He's an education advocate. He's also someone who's been running a business for over a decade. I think you're going to love this episode. We're going to talk about what does it mean to really break through barriers and create a sustainable path to success, especially for the youth in our country. Dig in, and here comes your good advice. Hey, you've checked out another episode of the Good Advice Podcast. We're talking with a special friend who his sweet spot is something that I'm quite passionate about. I have Paul Smith with me today. He's the president and owner of Education Reform Advocates, LLC. He focuses on dropout prevention, youth development, and even childhood obesity. He's an incredible person in the education field, and he's going to be sharing some knowledge with us today. Paul, thank you for being here today.
Thanks for having me on, Blake. Much appreciated.
Well, man, I'm excited to jump in and talk about, first of all, just running a business. You've been in business for over a decade, so you've beaten the statistic, so to speak. And also, man, I'm excited. I used to be a high school teacher myself, and so I'm excited to get some of your insights on today's education world. How about we just start with how you got started for your business?
Oh, well, that's a great question, and thanks for asking, Blake. So I really, it's funny how things happen. A lot of times, one door closes and another door opens in life. And what do you know is I ended up in the recession in 2008, right? I guess 2008, 2009. I ended up getting laid off from a small advocacy policy and advocacy group. And I said, "Oh my goodness, what this is a disaster. What's going to happen here? I got 2 kids at home. My wife's been home with the kids for going on 6 years now. It's been a single income situation." And I said, "Oh man, this is really bad news." And there was a lot of bad news in the ether at the time, anyway. In terms of the stock market and whatnot. So. Funny, I called an old boss that I worked with at Johns Hopkins, and we were doing school reform work together. And I just said, "Hey, just kind of explain the situation, what was happening." And it just so happened that he had a small project at a high school, Blue High School down in Southeast DC. And he needed help running a Twilight Academy, which was kind of an alternative education environment. And what do you know? So he said, when could you start? And I said, like, now, let's do it. And so I met him down there, and next thing you know, it started with one small project in 2009. And then I kind of expanded by trying to just pick up again, like smaller contracts and eventually some part-time work, which eventually became basically like a full-time employee situation. And what's interesting is over the 10 plus years, almost 11 years now, is I've had a lot of different iterations of this business. So, I've had 3 to 5 projects, like major projects running at a time. And then on the other hand, I've had one project where it's just like, that's all you do is work for one client. And so I will say that the sweet spot for me is kind of the multiple projects, multiple avenues, and kind of like the good analogy would be like an investment. You want to diversify a little bit in your work. Some contracts are shorter, longer than others. And so that's a little bit of a safety net built in, as opposed to just having one single client that you're working for. Mm-hmm. So that's just, so anyway, that's just, the different iterations have been it's been interesting to see. But I think for me personally, just in terms of sustainability, having the multiple projects running at a time seems to be the best fit. And
well, and listening to you, I mean, obviously the proof is there. Like I said, you've been in business for over a decade, which is rare. I think the statistic is something like 20 to 30% will actually make it for the full 10 years. And it just continues to drop after that point. And it feels like you gave an insight there that it feels like a lot of business owners struggle with sort of allowing the business to evolve over time. You use the word iterate. It feels like sometimes business owners, they are apprehensive at the thought of being agile, at letting their business change a little bit over time. And it sounds like you've kind of rolled with it to let your business develop.
You're exactly right, Blake. I think a good analogy, like really good football coaches figure out how to they find the right players, or they realize their players, and then they design the system and they make it work right around the players that they have. And I think a lot of people have the mindset of kind of like an old school coach who says, I'm going to make these players fit into my scheme, into my system. And I think a lot of, I see that in a lot of folks in the work world where, they just they're going to do it their way. And that's the way it's going to be. And that would be detrimental to me. I wouldn't be in business right now with that. I think I was just having this conversation with a client the other day about taking what's there, finding what's there, seeing what's there, and working with it, right? Not trying to fit the square peg in the round hole kind of situation, not just because you say you do this, that you have to do it that way. So always finding a way is really, I think adapting is really important, and being flexible also. I mean, I can remember my first teaching job. I'll never forget. I was trying to get into social studies. My big dream was to be a high school football coach. That's all I wanted to do growing up. And so I went to a small D3 school, played college football, and got a history degree, and was going to live that life, be a social studies teacher and coach ball. Like that was going to be it. And I'll never forget. And I was interviewing for one of my first jobs, and the principal said, "Look, I don't have a social studies job open right now, but if you teach world religions and world cultures, I'll give you the first job. I'll give you the first social studies job that opens up." And so I said, "All right, that's all right. Like I'll do that," because I just wanted to get the foot in the door. And I think that's just kind of one example of trying to be flexible. And I had no business teaching religion. I like to say I didn't know I didn't know fondue from Hindu. Like I didn't know anything. And here I am, what's the best way to figure out whether or not you really understand something is when you go teach it, as you know from your teaching experience.
Yeah,
right?
well,
you really gotta.
Oh my gosh, man! I feel like this. I'm sure this would be horrific for a former principal to hear, but I feel like I didn't become like immersed in what I was teaching until it was finally like I remember coming to my school and they were like, "Hey, you're going to teach aquatic science." And I was like, "What the heck is aquatic science?" Right. I'd gotten a biology degree, and so I had no idea. But like now I feel like I'm an expert on high school aquatic science. But at the time, I definitely probably had no business being in charge of that.
No. So you're exactly right. And so I think you have to believe in, you have to be confident enough in yourself that you can make these adjustments, and it may not be perfect, but it's in the if you have a kind of a vision for where you want to go, you'll take there are various paths to get there. Now, and it may not be, and I'll just give you one more quick example. Earlier when I was starting my business, one fellow who went on to become one of my main clients for many, many years. He asked me to do some government relations work for him for Reading is Fundamental, a national literacy nonprofit in DC. Right. And so I was like, government relations, I was a teacher. I worked in schools. I could work with principals, administrators, kids, but like politicians, are you kidding me? I mean, I don't know what I'm doing. He said, "Don't worry about it. You'll be all right." And so it ended up to be a great experience. I learned a ton. I mean, I just had coffee a couple weeks ago with the director of government relations, who's still there at RIF. And I really like that work actually now. And I would have never, ever known about that if I hadn't just, given it a try. And I like to, and I kind of still stay in that arena. I mean, part of the work that I'm doing now is leading the Reconnecting Youth campaign here in Baltimore. And that's advocating for federal dollars for programs that help kids who have kind of fallen off the rails. So your Job Corps, Youth Build, Conservation Corps, all the core type programs. Mm-hmm. So thankfully, like in retrospect, that work has kind of carried along with me, mm-hmm. And it's been really fun. But I would have never had any, 10 years ago, I would have been like, oh, I don't know anything about government relations. So anyway, I think part of it is just being willing to kind of like that Little Feat song, willing. You got to just be, ready to just kind of step out there and do it. So
now, since you mentioned football, the analogy that I think of is, do you remember when, Tim Tebow was playing for Florida and he was so, he was the dual threat quarterback, and he really, had kind of, made a name for himself of you never knew if he was going to keep the ball or if he was going to hand it off and maybe even air it out. Right. And I think about how Urban Meyer did such a great job, exactly what you're talking about, building his system around Tim Tebow. And it feels like business owners today, I don't want to say it's tough to roll with the punches, but exactly what you said. There's a difference between I'm going to take what I have and build my system from that versus I'm going to build the system and sort of fit the square peg into the round hole. Why does it feel like business owners today they really struggle with flexibility and agility and adaptability? And I know these are key concepts because I'm even part of a certification program where one of their new big assessments they're rolling out for executive leaders is it's built entirely on this concept of adaptability and agility. So I know it's a powerful concept, and yet I know I engage with a multitude of leaders who it's tough to build the mental fortitude, the mental appetite for flexibility. Why is that, do you think?
That is really a great question. I think a part of it is just a mindset, right? And it's a bit of a growth mindset, and being able to and being willing to take on the work to kind of keep always kind of looking for the edge for what people, both what the needs are, maybe that people see, or maybe they don't see it, but they have these issues in their organization. So I think there's keeping a sense of priorities for yourself and what you're seeing and being able to provide for folks, and then so I think that's really critical there. Yeah.
Well, I guess it's kind of like, and I can't think of the analogy, but it's like if you know what you want to provide in terms of the end result, does it really matter, like the method in terms of how you get there? And it feels like sometimes people get those backwards, where it's like, no, the method, and maybe it's comfort. Maybe it's like you said, it's mindset, where it's like, this feels really good because I know this system.
Yeah.
Even though it's maybe not getting the results that I aspire to get.
Yes. And that's a really good point. And I will say one thing about kind of, entrepreneurship, and I put that in air quotes because I think, entrepreneurs, they kind of, it can get a bad rap sometimes, self-employed, consultant, slacker, all in the same sentence. But I will say, the thing about running a business, you work so hard. And I think when you're a full-time employee in an organization, it's really easy to become complacent and and I found myself doing this at times, not necessarily becoming complacent, but you just kind of do your job. You really, and I don't think it was until I was working for myself and having to really expand the network and really be aggressive about, kind of what are the next projects that you're going to work on. I think it's easier. It's kind of easy sometimes within an organization to kind of sit back and say like, well, what's next? And you kind of, rather than being really aggressive and looking for what to do, a lot of times folks kind of just wait, like, well, what is the assignment? And I think there's a big difference in motivation there for people, and what, what kind of gets you excited when you get up in the morning and go to work. Like if you're told like you're going to do X, Y, I'm very bad with that. Like I've always been, it's just, that's a hard, and so I think that's, people find themselves in that, kind of in that situation a lot of times, where, you are assigned these 1, 2, or 3 things. And that's a little different than saying like, I went out and got, these are 3 things that I'm doing because it's what I want to do, and I'm heading in that direction.
Yeah.
So,
and it feels like great leaders are able to, and I don't even want to, it feels like it's cheapening it to call it like motivation, but there is a motivational piece here, but it feels like great leaders are able to get their employees from that sort of like, and it's not laziness. It's just, I think of it as like inaction, like where they're waiting to be told what to do. And it feels like great leaders are able to move that person into, now they're the go-getter, they're going out and they're making things happen on behalf of the business. And it feels like, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, you are 100% right. And I'll tell you just a quick story. So one of the best bosses I ever had, who's still a client of mine now. So I was a young guy, say 30-ish, right? Maybe not even 30. And he was the CEO of this nonprofit, basically. And he calls me in his office and he's like, all right, let's look at this resume. And we had a resume meeting. This was not about like, and I thought we were going to have a project meeting, like, kind of go over some of the responsibilities. And he's like, we talked about strengths and weaknesses within the resume, within the, went way beyond the scope of work. And it was the first time I had been introduced to a leader like that, who was really visionary and was like, hey man, you got to be thinking big picture here. And, that was so valuable. And it's just, I've kind of taken that with me wherever I've gone, that kind of, and not necessarily, helping clients with that exact kind of activity, but just as a mindset for folks that I do work with, and trying to, be a valuable resource for them, and just trying to think and helping folks think about the big picture. With that, so there are leaders who do, and then there are leaders who, they're in charge, right? And so,
and I think that's part of it, right? It's a lot of times I think people don't get like the leverage or like the permission to be assertive, because it's more about the owner's ego. And well, that's my decision to make. Or, I was talking to somebody who, and she ended up leaving this job, but she had been hired. It was like an events coordinator position. And she had gone out and created some of these events and gotten the community businesses involved. And it was this really incredible deal. Well, her boss pulled her aside and was like, why did you do this? Like, why did you create this stuff? And she was like, well, that's like what my job is, right? Like, you want me to? And she's like, yeah, it is your job. But I would prefer that I decide what you go do and what you spend your time on. Which she was like, but that doesn't really make sense, because that's not your job, it's my job. And she was like, yeah, but this is my thing. And so it was kind of this weird, awkward, like, just like a controlling ordeal. And I see that happen a lot. And it's not always ego. Sometimes it's people who they don't know how to trust their employees. But all I can think about is it creates a very slow business. Because you're waiting on this central person to, make decisions and decide what's going to happen, rather than it's so much faster to just trust your people and let them go do. Yeah.
Right.
And
just go do it. Right.
Let me parent these people. So,
yeah. And I think, and that's part of the, if you're kind of making a chart of pros and cons of entrepreneurship or advice for, in the business sense, like one of the best things about working for yourself is that, you say you're on site helping a client, and you see those situations that you just described so clear, right? And this is happening, and it's not necessarily your area to be involved with, but you see some of these total roadblocks, and then you walk out the door and you say, okay, like this was great, like, so, you're there for the day, and then, you kind of like, that's, that's basically where, you know, as someone who's coming in from the outside, it's really good to be able to just come and go. And yeah. And the going can be really great because, if you're part of the organization, and I've been a part of, an organization that maybe wasn't the most functional at one time and may have been somewhat toxic. And that's really hard. It carries over to your personal life. That's one of I had to leave a job at one point because I remember I was rocking one of my kids to sleep, and after story time, and like I found myself getting mad, and here I am with my kid, my son Gordy, and I'm like, oh my god, like this is crazy that I'm thinking about people or situations at work, and I'm here with what I care the most about in the world. And so that's when I the light bulb went on, like, okay, this, you need to make
something has to change
transition here. And so speaking of that, I think with kind of entrepreneurship and being in business for yourself, one really important thing is having a partner. If you are in a relationship, really being clear about how that is going to work. And because along with all those different iterations of the business that I had described before, I have the most loving and supportive spouse who was, she's my biggest fan, right? And so, and I couldn't, and it hasn't been all roses, believe me. I mean, we, in terms of working together, but we've always been on the same page for the most part. And I think it was early on, it was a little bit the risk. There has to be some tolerance for risk when you're an entrepreneur, right? But you got to consider your spouse also. And looking back, I don't know if I did enough. Was I probably could have done a little better job of communicating, right? Always kind of relationships are always boiled down to like communication. If you do a really good job of communicating, things tend to go better, right? But as we've evolved, over the course of the past 10 years, and we've seen different versions of the business, and at one time it was the only income stream, and at one time it's been, paired off with where my wife Erin is working as a full-time employee. And so we've seen all kinds of different iterations of that. But I think having a supportive partner and someone that you're able to, because you're in business, like, not only are you your partner, your friends, your best friends, your love, but you're also business partners. So you got to be able to talk about that stuff. And so that's really, really important, I think. It can't be underestimated for anyone who's thinking about, and I can't tell you how many people I talk to who say, yeah, I think I want to, I'm thinking about branching off on my own. I'm thinking about it. Right. And so they're probably listening to shows like yours, like as they're thinking about it. But I think that would be one thing to be really, and if you're not in a relationship, that's a whole nother thing. But
I think even if you don't have like a spouse to be that person for you, you got to have your network of fuel, the people who are going to keep you going, keep you encouraged. I just think about starting my business, and I've been in business for, I guess, about a year and a half. I would not have made it past probably the first month without my wife being, frankly, I probably, took way more from her than I should have. But being just the rock, the central force, hey, this is what you're called to do. I don't know if I could have made it. Yeah. And a lot of people in entrepreneurship, all they know is this very sexy, fluffy description of entrepreneurship. Hey, you make your own hours. In fact, here's a couple of things that I heard over the last year. Someone was like, oh, you're an entrepreneur, so you get to just wake up whenever you want. I was like, okay, is that what we see as entrepreneurship? And then I had another guy, he was around 18, 19, maybe 20 years old. And he said, man, all I want to be in life is an entrepreneur. And I said, okay, well, what do you think that means? And he said, it means that I can do whatever I want and no one's going to tell me what I need to do. And I go, okay, that actually sounds like immaturity. It doesn't sound like you want to be an entrepreneur. It sounds like you're immature and you want to just do whatever you want, because it is really hard. It is really challenging. and you have to have, there's a level of endurance. I mean, you've been in it for over 10 years. There's a level of endurance that has to happen, I think, to make it long term.
Yeah, no question. And, you know, you have a bad day every once in a while. I mean, it's like life, you know, I mean, but I think the constant is is the work, right? You got to keep at it. And, you know, you get up early, like to that point earlier that you just mentioned, you know, my alarm is, you know, it's going off before 5 most days. Right. And we're getting going. So there's a lot to do. Well, but the other thing is also, I think it's really important is to surround, you know, kind of keep yourself surrounded by great people, right? Not only like in your own nuclear family, like presumably like your wife and whatnot, or your spouse, or your partner. But I think with other aspects of your life, just finding people who are really great people to connect with is so important. You know, whether it's a faith community, or if it's a local group of guys or gals who hang out together in the neighborhood, or it's your workout buddies. You know, I think that is just as far as sustainability and keeping things moving, even though it's not directly related to your business. There's a guy I ride my bike with, a neighbor down the street, Scott. I love hanging out with. We talk, like he's a great person, thoughtful, interesting guy. And, you know, I think it's finding people who kind of radiate positive energy is so important, just because, I mean, the world's tough out there. And, you know, it's doggy dog. So the most, you know, the more folks that you have, that you count on, that you care about, they care about you. Yeah. Especially at the local community level. I mean, we're so blessed to be involved with a faith community, Episcopal faith community here in Baltimore, because we have problems in Baltimore City. Like there's a lot going on here that's not so great, but we're doing work, right? And we're trying to help move, you know, trying to do a lot of the right thing and help folks move in the right direction. So, I mean, I think, you know, because it's easy to just kind of, for people, I think, to just throw their hands up in the air and say like, oh, it's just bad problems, you know, but I think finding people who are solution oriented, and whether that's you know, a men's group or a job seekers group or a church group, whatever that is, I think it's so important to, especially if you're on your own as an entrepreneur, because part of what you lose is the community the water cooler, right? There's no more water cooler to go to. So where everybody, you know, so you got to create your own water coolers. And I've done it. You know, I've tried to do that through various avenues, you know, exercise or working out.
Well, and that's such an amazing piece of advice, because I remember starting my business in like week 1 thinking, wow, this is pretty lonely. like there's, and it's just like you said, I guess I didn't think about how valuable that work community was. And it was kind of like, man, this is, you know, it's like, I don't know if you've ever seen like Parks and Rec, but one of the main characters, I can't remember if he gets laid off or what happens, but he starts doing like this claymation video on himself. And it's just really sad. And it's like, his friend is like, okay, wow, we really need to get you like connected with people again, because this is scary. That's how I was feeling. Like week 1 was kind of like, okay, this is tough. This is daunting. And so I think you're spot on.
Yeah. And to your point, so one other aspect of sustainability that is very connected to that idea is finding the right people that you are, as an entrepreneur, who you connect with on certain teams, and finding great people and staying connected to those people. So, because I certainly probably wouldn't be in business right now if I hadn't met people. Like, I'm thinking about a woman, Leslie. She was the former director of high schools in Portland, and we were on a Department of Education project together. And I still call her for advice. Like, she's seen it all, right? And she's been not only as like working in a school district, but being as a consultant, and then as a parent and grandparent. But and I remember having a conversation with her, at one point, because you have ebbs and flows in business, right? And I remember thinking, man, I think this might be the end of the run. About 8 years ago, I thought, well, I think it's time to have a regular job, in air quotes, right?
Yeah.
Have a regular job, for whatever that's worth. And having that conversation with someone like Leslie, who was like, that's kind of, and being able to talk through that,
Yeah.
And getting advice from folks who have had similar and interesting experiences, and who you trust and who know you. And I think that's really important also. So finding the connection, so you don't have that water cooler, but online helps because you can get together a little bit more. But you've got to your point, I think every chance you get to connect with folks that you've either worked with before, or folks you're working with, is really important. So you don't get into kind of like that isolation chamber kind of place, which that's not a real real healthy place to be. So.
Yeah. Well, we're, man, it's amazing how fast the time goes. We're running out of time. I really want to spend some time before we wrap up. I want to talk about education, because this is it's probably the most important topic for me as a professional, is our public education system. I know you do a lot in education. I'm very much troubled, having been a high school teacher in inner city Houston. I'm very much troubled how little education gets mentioned in terms of like, and this is all political candidates. I never see it quite as the banner, this is the focus conversation. And yet I've seen it firsthand that our education system needs so much help. Our kids need so much help. And so I'd love to hear more about what you're doing, how you're supporting school systems, what's your passion there?
Yeah. So I think, and you're right. I mean, that's where it all starts, with kids in school. And I think, it's, I wonder, I've often asked myself, could I go back and be a teacher today with all of the responsibilities that teachers are being asked to do, right? For be the counselor, caregiver, I just, and then we're going to grade you on a test and see how your kids do on a test. And we're going to grade you, we're going to base your performance evaluation on that. I mean, that is insane. I mean, that is really
well. And let me jump in for a second, because I have listeners that are all over the spectrum politically, and so let me add some context for the listeners. And this is not biased, which people who maybe disagree with me are going to be like, no, that is biased. But having been a teacher, let me add some context to some of these state tests, for example. So as a teacher, maybe you're teaching a dozen different units in a year. The state test might pull one random question from each unit that is, it's not really skills oriented. It's really not critical thinking oriented. Some can be, but for the most part, it's. I've seen some questions that are just random details that you hope the kid has remembered. And so, having said that, the state test is actually quite removed contextually from what's actually happening in the classroom. And so I'm giving that context because for the person who's a listener, maybe doesn't know this world very, very much, they may be thinking, well, yeah, why wouldn't you evaluate teachers? I mean, the test is the output. Why wouldn't you?
Right.
And so all I'm doing is I'm trying to help explain it's not as cut and simple as maybe you're thinking. It's actually very disjointed and disconnected. And man, Paul, you've really nailed it as well in terms of the multiple roles of a teacher. I remember when I was a teacher in Houston, for budget reasons, they had to remove all what they saw as extraneous positions. So they removed all paraprofessionals, they removed all speech therapists, and so the only role in the classroom or in the school was the teacher, who now is, you're managing the instruction, you're managing advocacy for your students, you're managing the specific needs of someone who would have utilized a paraprofessional. And in my case, my biggest class was 45 people. And so you're managing,
That's it?
That's it. Which my principal mentioned legally, it was only supposed to be 35, which I don't think it would have been any better. But I feel like I'm just venting right now, but there's a lot happening in the education space that brings a lot of complexity. So it really isn't as cut and dry as maybe sometimes we like to make it.
Yeah, yeah, you're exactly right. I think one of my big frustrations with, especially with to your point of testing, I mean, it's just a snapshot of progress, right? And so most of the schools that I've been working with over the years, and the districts that I've been working with over the years, I mean, they're struggling with complicated issues of poverty, right? And
Yes.
so,
Right.
I mean, to think, and there's no magic wand to get to make sure that students are, um, you know, reading on grade level. We know. I mean, research tells us that by third grade, I mean, we can kind of track where students are, and so, I mean, it's not. We know we've got to kind of front load our system, but we're not seeing the political will to make that happen. And I think our state tests, sure, they give you a snapshot of where kids are, but I mean, where does it tell you about growth, right? What about the kid who comes into ninth grade but was reading at a fifth grade level and just about dropped out of school because they were so doggone frustrated, right? But they hung with it and they made up. Now they're reading at an eighth grade level, but they're still failing on the state, like when they get the report card. So what good does that do, right? I mean, come on now, who is that helping?
Yeah,
right?
and I think that context, it's hard, man, it's hard for people to understand the context. And it's much easier, and this is what I've seen happen, it's much easier for people to say, oh, that student is just lazy. Oh, their parents just don't care about school. And there's a lot of misinformation. And I remember I had a student one time, he was in ninth grade, and I taught science. But I remember doing math flashcards, like those little flashcards, like multiple.
Oh yeah.
I remember I was doing these flashcards with him, and actually it was addition is what it was. And so like 11 plus 14, and he was a ninth grader. He was like, yep. I don't know. And I feel like the way the political conversation has gone is someone says, well, that's just a student who's lazy. They haven't put in the time to learn it. But actually the context is he was from El Salvador. Yeah. Up to that point that he had come to the States, he had lived on a farm, zero education whatsoever, zero education system. The infrastructure wasn't there from where he lived. So this year in high school was his very first immersion into an actual functioning school system. And so I feel like the test data and even public perception, we lose that context sometimes. And what we like to do instead is say, well, that's just a bad teacher. Well, their parents just must not care. Well, they must just be lazy, instead of recognizing that there's systemic differences because of poverty.
Yep.
That's my rant, I guess. Yeah. I get really passionate about this stuff, obviously, so I don't mean to take over. But
No, I think you're 100% right. And I don't, and I think that, I mean, I guess I feel your frustration. I do. And I think what I've tried to do with my business is, as part of it, is twofold. I'm trying to help organizations who build scaffolding into their programming to help kids who are behind and try to get them up to speed so they can, read at grade level, pass the test, and graduate on time. I mean, that's the idea, and go to whatever path they choose, right? A positive path in life, whether it's trade school, military, higher ed, community college, doesn't matter, right? So that's part of it. And I think, so the other part though, is, and I think systemically, we do a really poor job of taking the group of youth who have kind of fallen off the rails and figuring out how can we rectify this situation? How can we get kids? I don't think a kid should be, I personally don't think a kid should be in jail or punished for the rest of his life because they made a bad decision in ninth grade. And they decided to drop out of school. Like, I don't think that should necessarily follow them for their entire life, right? It's like, so I think, just give you some, like, we have over 15,000 kids in Baltimore who are between 16 and 24 who aren't in school, aren't working, aren't actively looking for work, right? And so that's a group of kids who like, they need some TLC, right? We need to figure out a plan. And those, and the youth need to, and the youth, they want to be held accountable for themselves, right? People want a positive, people want a path to self-sustainability. And we do such a poor job, I think, not just, and I'm not finger wagging at Baltimore. This is universal in the country. I mean, Houston, St. Louis, Miami. I mean, no one's immune to this issue. Some cities are really like, there's some really good systems in place, like LA, and where they've got labor working. They've got multiple organizations at the municipal level working together around education and workforce development. And that's where you're seeing some really great results that I think can be emulated in other cities. But I think, I feel really strongly that this is a kind of a forgotten group that is really important to address and to figure out, to help them get a plan and for themselves. Mm-hmm. And, if we don't, because we see what happens. I mean, there's a moral side to this in terms of every kid should kind of have a path, right? And there's an economic side to this too. I mean, it's a drain on, from a systems perspective, right? Mm-hmm. If a kid is involved in systems, public systems for whatever they be, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, and they're not involved in the employment, right? It's way out of whack in terms of what they're contributing to the economy. So I think there's kind of the return on investment for good programming argument, as well as just kind of the moral, like, hey, it's the right thing to do to help people, even if they have made a mistake, provide some kind of positive path forward that they know about, right? And so having people talk about this, I mean, some cities are really, there's a national re-engagement network that meets regularly, and they do a great job, but it's kind of under the radar. It's not what presidential candidates are talking about, and it's not just something that's, in regular everyday conversation. But I just think it's really important. So I there's my rant. You had yours. That was mine. So.
Well, and I guess I'll just say I wish it wasn't I just wish there wasn't a political. It's almost like whatever side you're on dictates your perception of the schooling system. And for me, and maybe I'm just, a crazy millennial, but for me, I just think let's remove the political alias from the conversation. And we're talking about having the compassion to see a kid have their options restored to them, in the sense of maybe, because frankly, I remember there had this one kid who was so challenging. He was so difficult. He ended up going to jail. He got arrested for, he was selling some drug. I can't remember what the drug was, but he was selling drugs, and he got arrested and went to jail. But the backstory there is, when he was like 11 or 12 years old, his dad would take him on like the drug dealing, jobs. And in fact, his dad had actually taken him with him to kill someone who had stolen money from him, and the son had actually witnessed this happening. Oh. And so I think what happens sometimes is you lose the context where this kid's now in the juvenile detention system. But when you look at what that kid's life's been like, it's hard not to have compassion and recognize we need some pathway for this person to get back on the right path. But what's easier, I think, sometimes is, well, that's, their fault, or, it's, I don't know.
Yeah, no, I know. And I think more and more people, in local communities are realizing that there are really good programs, core, like Civic Works and core programs that are helping youth exactly how you're describing their situation. And I think just the more and more that we have of programming like that, and in general awareness, just the better off that we're going to be. So
everybody needs to go hug a teacher today. Get some encouragement.
And they are the workers. They really are. I love when people say, "Oh yeah, they'll just go teach." I always think, "Oh yeah, yeah, you're in." If you think you just go teach, that is some work. And Yeah, that is really, really hard, very rewarding. But and nobody's, making a fortune in the classroom. And it is really hard work.
Teachers are heroes, they're heroes, man. They're making it happen. So
yeah.
Anyway, now that I'm sure I've pissed off half of my listener base, but then inspired the other half. We've unfortunately run out of time. We've talked a lot about entrepreneurship, business. Everybody needs to go out and thank a teacher, by the way. Paul, what's the one thing for my listeners if they want to follow you, engage with you? Maybe they want to write you a nasty email because I've totally, cynicized this whole thing. What's the one thing that you would like people to go do to stay connected with you?
They could, gosh, that's a great question, Blake. Email is always easy, or website. I have a website, paulsmithconsulting.org, or email pbs1207@gmail. If you put that up on, I'll put all my contact info.
Yeah.
And I'm always happy to talk to anyone about entrepreneurship. Stranger, I would say, please don't be a stranger. Having been in a situation where, with a job loss and wondering what to do, I've always felt really strongly about just being if I can help in any way, if you're facing that kind of situation or just wondering about kind of what to do next or just want to bounce an idea off, I'd be all ears and be interested in helping. So
I love it. Well, Paul, you've been a fantastic guest today.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you so much, Blake. This was great. And I love your podcast. It's great. I've got it on my playlist, and I listened to last week, Mary, the leadership conference, and then the follow up with the sales. The topics are great. The samurai, right?
Yeah. John Molyneux.
I still remember him, the customer for life, and I think that's really good. That's great advice, just in the work world. Be the worker that people want to have.
Yeah. His episode, we're talking about John Molyneux. His episode is the most downloaded episode for the last 30 days.
Wow.
So you chose a great one.
Yeah.
But hey, everyone needs to be listening to this episode, not somebody else's. So anyway, but again, I appreciate you coming on. Thanks for being here today.
Okay. Thank you, Blake.
For our listeners, if you have not subscribed to the podcast, man, what are you waiting on? You got to click that subscribe button. Get it on any platform to get our updates to the show once or twice weekly. Also, if you enjoyed this episode, man, Paul was phenomenal. Definitely leave us a 5-star review. Man, especially if you're in our Northwest Arkansas area, you got to leave us a Google review and talk about how this podcast is helping you and your business. Hey, I appreciate you listening. We'll catch you later. See ya.